Welcome to another edition of Church and State with Brian McCall and Chris Ferrara. This is our first episode of 2022. I hope you had a great Christmas and New Year.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, you had a good Christmas?
I'm a COVID survivor.
COVID survivor. You're a
Looks like it
statistic.
looks like I had the Delta variant, and I have to say, it wasn't the worst flu in terms of acuteness, but in terms of length, definitely unusual. It went on for 3 weeks, and my wife still hasn't recovered her sense of taste or smell. But I'm a COVID survivor. No vaccination. Not that it makes a difference because all the vaccinated people are getting it too.
Right.
I suppose we'll get into that in a moment.
In a minute, yes. No, if it's anything like mine, I had the same experience last year. It was definitely not the most severe or acute, but it was long and strange. I don't know about you. I'd start to feel
Yeah.
better and then get worse and feel better and get worse, like bounce up and down. It was very weird.
Yeah, my doctor said that the first 8 days are irrelevant. It's what happens in weeks 2 and 3.
Right. Well. Speaking of which, our topic is the Supreme Court. On Friday of last week, they issued two rulings in two unrelated cases, which to many observers may seem contradictory. So the Biden administration had required all U.S. companies with more than 100 workers, because I guess if there's less than 100 workers, you can all die. They don't care. But more than 100 workers to have a COVID vaccine mandate. And they struck that down, said that is unconstitutional. It's against federal law, exceeds power, etc. And then they had another companion case that was the mandate related just to facilities, healthcare facilities that accept Medicare and Medicaid. Those must have a vaccine mandate for their employees. They allowed that to go forward. So they withdrew the injunction that was stopping that one. So they let one go, stopped another. The business one is probably, in terms of people, larger, covered probably 100 million Americans, where the Medicare and Medicaid's maybe about 10 million. So, but still seems to be a little inconsistent. So can you maybe start by helping us make sense of what was Supreme Court doing?
Well, I
Why?
have the two decisions here. This one
Yeah.
is the short one, which strikes down the OSHA mandate. This one is the longer one, which upholds
Mm-hmm.
the Medicare mandate.
Mm.
So, in both cases, we have obvious agency overreach.
Mm.
And what is implicated here is what is called the major questions doctrine, which is the principle that you do not defer to agency regulations when they touch upon matters of vast economic significance or national importance. In other words, you don't let an agency legislate, perform the function of Congress. Another way of expressing it is the non-delegation doctrine. Congress can't just delegate its legislative authority to an agency and let it run roughshod over the rights of 100, 200, 300 million people. So
Mm.
on the OSHA mandate, the court reasoned fairly well here and simply said, this is overreach. This is not an occupational hazard. This is a hazard that one encounters throughout society. The virus infects everybody everywhere now, despite the COVID vaccinations. There's nothing here that's peculiar to the workplace. So OSHA has no business mandating that employees be vaccinated for a hazard that confronts everybody in daily life. This is nothing occupational that we're talking about here, but simply a virus that has now become endemic. But there's a fatal flaw in this decision, which I hope the evil bureaucrats will not exploit. And here it is on page 7 of the decision, and I quote, "We do not doubt, for example, that OSHA could regulate researchers who work with the COVID-19 virus." Okay, that's reasonable enough. But then they go on to say, so too could OSHA regulate risks associated with working in a particularly crowded or cramped environment. What? What exactly is a cramped environment? We all find ourselves every day in crowded or cramped environments. Supermarkets, our own homes, cars, mass transit. So, what is the standard here for defining cramped? They've left OSHA an opening to try to craft some kind of regulation for cramped environments. But otherwise, the decision rightly holds that OSHA simply has no power to regulate vaccination, to mandate vaccination for a virus that is a societal problem, not an occupational one. And that's a 6-3 decision. So far,
And the
so good.
six were the three Trump appointees: Alito, Thomas, and Chief Justice
Roberts.
Roberts, right?
Right. But then we get to the CMS mandate, the Medicare mandate, mandating the vaccination of 10 million healthcare workers. And what happened here is, in my view, a huge problem. Maybe disaster isn't too extreme a description of this decision, because what the majority does here, and it's a bare 5-4 majority, thanks to Kavanaugh joining the majority. What they do here is they cobble together a number of vague references to health and safety. There's also a sanitation requirement regulation. There's a regulation for residential facilities, i.e., nursing homes, that requires surveillance, prevention, and control of infectious diseases. And based on this cobbling together of various assorted regulations. And by the way, the regulations are the cart that follows the horse, because first you have the congressional authorization of an agency to act, and then the agency promulgates regulations. You can't use the regulations to define the scope of the original enactment, because that puts the cart before the horse. If that were the case, then all you have to do is launch an agency, then it issues a bunch of regulations defining its own authority, and you're paralyzed by the regulations. But the court just relies on these regulations to say, well, there's regulation of health and safety involved here, and sanitation, control of infectious diseases, and they find by 5-4 that the CMS mandate can go forward, and 10 million healthcare workers can be vaccinated whether they like it or not, under penalty of being fired. But at least here we have a religious exemption and also a medical exemption. So if you have a religious objection to vaccination, the Solicitor General was at pains to note that, of course, religious objections to vaccination must be respected, which helps us, by the way, in the New York State vaccine mandate challenge, which is a separate subject. But the dissents rightly note, and I'm talking about the dissent by Justice Thomas, joined by Alito, Gorsuch, and Barrett, and also a concurring opinion by Justice Gorsuch, which has some interesting points. The dissent notes that, first of all, controlling infectious diseases, although that's required by Medicare regulations, means controlling the spread of a disease in a hospital through the usual sanitary measures, sterilization of surfaces, wearing of masks, isolation, and so forth. Nothing here authorizes the mandatory vaccination of every healthcare worker. There's no authority for that. So basically, what they've done here is to justify blatant overreaching on behalf of Medicare CMS. And interestingly enough, as the dissent notes, the virus has been in circulation for 2 years. Vaccines have been available for at least 10 months, now 11 months. So where's the emergency? Why did the agency wait so long? And the agency's only argument is, well, no one is prejudiced by the delay. That isn't the point. Whether someone is prejudiced by the delay of at least 10 months in promulgating the so-called emergency regulation, the issue there is their duty to act promptly in the case of an emergency, if it really is an emergency, and if it isn't, to allow public comment before the rule is adopted. Those procedures weren't followed here. They just issued an emergency regulation 10 months after the emergency supposedly began. And they're getting away with it by a 5-4 majority. And unfortunately, that's a problem, because as the dissent notes, now the executive branch is going to be emboldened in future cases to cobble together some vague language in its own regulations, which is a kind of administrative self-justification, to impose all kinds of regulations on people in violation of the separation of powers and the non-delegation doctrine, taking on legislative authority. There's a real risk.
Isn't that the crux of the real problem here? Because isn't this how tyrants and dictators operate? They sidestep
exactly
the
right.
law. They sidestep the law, and they just want to proclaim things without any process, without just, well, this is my will. And isn't that really what this is? I mean, it's been going on a long time in this country, building to, but this kind of upholding this kind of act by the Supreme Court with no congressional action. Biden has had a majority in both houses of Congress for this whole year. They didn't do anything, and the agency doesn't even want to take the time to go through the process.
No, and we know this is a political game. Let's talk about the factual context.